Okay, just a quick summary, especially for those who weren't here before. So we're in the 6th chapter of Masechet Yoma, and we began the chapter by discussing how the 2 goats were chosen. One goat is going to be brought as a korban chatat, and one of them will be chosen to go to Azazel, to be sent out to the wilderness, and we'll talk more about that soon. So the Mishnah, in the beginning of the chapter, talked about how they're chosen and what happens if one dies before you finish the avodah on the other one, and then beginning with Mishnah Bet, we come back to the order of what was actually happening on Yom Kippur. And there, at this point, with the Kohen Gadol would take the Sir LaAzazel, the Sir, also called the Sir HaMishtaleach, the goat that's going to be sent, and he would lean his hands on it and say a vidui, say a confessional for the sins of Israel. And eventually, I don't know, maybe even next week, I do want to come back to this so that we understand what each thing here is being mechaper for. What is each thing bringing atonement for? Because we have the par, we have the bull that was brought by the Kohen for him and his fellow Kohanim. And then we had the Sir Lechatat, that was the Sir for the people. And those were used in the process. It's then described. It's described earlier in the Mishnah. It's described earlier in the Mishnah that he had to take the blood from each of those animals, and he had to sprinkle them in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and then he had to sprinkle them across the parochet in the Kodesh, and then he had to sprinkle blood on the altar that's in the Kodesh, the Mizbeach HaKtoret. And the Torah says it's to be mechaper for Tumot B'nai Yisrael. And then we also have now this Sir HaMishtaleach, and in the Vidui, he's asking kapara for avonot and psha'im and chata'im of B'nai Yisrael. Right, so for avonot were the sins that were done on purpose, and psha'im were sins that were done rebelliously, and chata'im were sins that were done unknowingly. So what sins are those, and how does this compare to the other confessionals that he gave earlier, where he was also asking for kapara? So the idea is that each of them is mechaper on particular sets of chata'im, particular sets of sins. So I do want to come back to that. That's not discussed in the Mishnah here. It's discussed in the Mishnah in the beginning of Masechet Shavuot. So maybe we'll take a look there, but not today. So after he did the vidui, then he would give over the Sir HaMishtaleach. He'd give over this goat that's going to be sent off to the wilderness to a person who had already been chosen, and he's going to be taking it out. And so last time we saw this in Mishnah Gimel, that in principle, halachically, any Jew could take this goat, but the Kohanim, or the Girsa that we have, the Kohanim Gedolim, made a kind of a fixed rule that they would only give it to another Kohen to take out. So then we get up to Mishnah Daled. This is where we're going to start our focus for today. We talked about some of this last time, but I wanted to finish off some of the discussion. So this Mishnah tells us, the Kevesh Asulo Mipnei Habavliim. So they made a ramp for him or for it because of the Babylonians. There's the Babylonian citizens among them, people who had come originally from Babylonia. Shahayum Talshim Besaro, that they would pull at his hair and say to him, take Tolbit say, take and go, take and go. And last time we discussed whose hair were they pulling at, who was the ramp for. Was it for the person who's taking the goat, or was it for the goat? And whose hair were they pulling? Were they pulling at the hair of the person taking the goat, or were they pulling at the hair of the goat? And Tolbit say, take and go. Were they talking to the person who was taking the goat, that he should take the goat and go out? Or were they, as it were, talking to the goat and saying, take our sins and go out? So we saw that there are different interpretations of that, but practically speaking, it doesn't make much difference, because the ramp that was made would be, servicing both the person taking the goat and the goat. And then it says, Mi kirei Yerushalayim hayim lavino toat sukkah harishona. And then from the important people of Jerusalem, they would accompany him until the first sukkah. Eser sukkot miyushalayim v'ad suk. There were 10 sukkot from Jerusalem until the cliff. Tishim ris. This is a distance of 90 ris. Shiva mechza l'chol meal. And there was 7.5 for every meal. So this is what I wanted to explain this week, what these distances were and where exactly did he go. So Tishim ris, the Bartanura says Tishim ris hayum Yerushalayim v'ad hatzuk. There was 90 ris from Jerusalem until the cliff. Kol har gavo v'zakuf karui tzuk. Any tall and straight mountain is called a tzuk. And the idea here is this also from the Gemara, that it would be a part of the mountain that would have a sheer drop on one side. Oh, here's Paul. Just a second. Shiva. So how much is a ris? What is this distance? A ris is a distance that's only occasionally mentioned in the Gemara, and there are, of course, like everything else, different opinions about exactly how long it is, and we'll see in a moment what the Bartanura says. So Shiva mechza risim l'chol meal. The Mishnah says that there are 7.5 for each meal, and 7.5 what? So the Bartanura explains, meaning there's 7.5 ris for every meal. So a meal, which of course I guess etymologically is related to the word mile, a meal is 2,000 amot. That's a meal. So there's 7.5 ris in every meal. And the Bartanura says, Ani shamati du rus garsinan bevav. I heard that the correct version is not ris, but rus, with a vav and not with a yud. Vehem matayim v'shishim v'shesh psiyot. That's 266 steps. Kecheshbon rus, like the total of the letters rus, resh vav samech. The total would be 266. So the idea is that a ris or a rus is 266 steps, which in this context is supposed to mean that it's 266 amot. So if it's 266 amot, so then he explains, Nimtzu shiv'a risinu mechza alpayim pachot chamisha. So then if you do the math, we find that 7.5 risin is going to equal 2,000 amot less 5, right? 266 times 7.5 comes out to 1995. Karov midat chum Shabbat. So it's almost the distance of Tchum Shabbat. The Tish'im Ris, the 90 Ris that it says that the distance was from Jerusalem until the Tzuk, that would be 12 meal. And I made my own little note here. It's 12 meal minus 60, right? Because for every meal, you take away 5 amot. Right? So that's the math, which I think I did this on a separate sheet. Here we go. Right, so a ris, I have this here. Make this a little larger. So one ris is 266 amot. So altogether 90 ris is going to be 23,940 amot. 7.5 ris is 1,995 amot, which is a meal less 5 amot, right? So the total distance is 23,940 amot, which is achingly close to 24,000 amot. And 24,000 amot, that would be a distance of 12 meal, right? So each meal is 2,000. Now, why they chose to use the measure of a ris, I'm guessing it seems to be hinted at with the language of the Bartanura here, that the ris was a measure that people maybe measured by walking. It was so many steps, and that the average step of a person, the average stride would be an amma, and that's how you could measure. In any event, all of these things were measured out beforehand, so that from the time he leaves Jerusalem until he gets to the Tzuk, it's going to be just under 12 meal. And he's going to stop, according to the Mishnah, there are 10 rest stops, as it were, along the way. There are these sukkot that were prepared beforehand, and there'll be people inhabiting those sukkot, and he can stop at each one. And as we'll see in the next Mishnah, people there are going to offer him food and drink. There are other opinions about how many sukkot there were, but at least for right now, we'll just go with the way the Mishnah brings it down. Now, exactly where he went to, we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So now we're up to Mishnah Hey. Mishnah Hey, Al kol sukkah v'sukkah omrim lo harei mazon v'harei mayim. At each and every sukkah, they would say to him, here is food and here is water. And they would accompany him from one sukkah to another sukkah, or the next sukkah, except for the last one. Because that last person who was in the last sukkah, the 10th sukkah, he would not accompany him all the way to the tzuk, ela omein merachok v'roeh et ma'asav. Rather, he would stand from afar and he would see his actions. He would witness his actions. Okay, so okay. So we find out that the shaliach who has the sira nishtaleach is accompanied the entire time, that from the time he leaves Jerusalem until just before he gets to the tzuk, but at a certain point he goes by himself. And so Bartanur says at every sukkah they say to him, Harei mazon v'harei mayim, here is food and here is water. And Bartanur explains, Lo hayu omrim lo kach ela kedei she'yitav libo. They didn't say that to him except to make him feel good, right? Literally to make his heart good. Shemi sheyesh lo pat b'salo eino ra'ev k'mi she'en lo pat b'salo. Someone who has bread in his basket is not hungry like the person who doesn't have bread in his basket. Avo me'olam lo hutzrach adam l'chach. But it never happened that a person needed this food. So what does it mean? What's the mashal here, that a person who has bread in his basket isn't hungry like a person who doesn't have bread in his basket?
Well, it's Yom Kippur, so he's not eating, so he's hungry. But the fact that there's food available to him, I guess, eases the hunger a little bit.
Yeah, imagine. It's right. The Bartanur here adds in the words "eino ra'ev." This is from the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Mi sheyesh lo pat b'solo eino dome mi sheyesh pat b'solo mi she'en lo pat b'solo." And Bartanur adds in, by way of explanation, in what way are they not alike? That the person who has bread in his basket, in other words, a person who has food available, is not going to be hungry like the person who doesn't have any food available. So knowing that food is nearby, psychologically eases the burden of the fast. And I think there's a lot of truth to this, just based on my own personal experience. That
Shel?
Yes.
I think the problem of the Isha'iti should be that the tzama, that he could be very, very thirsty, because Yom Kippur can be on a Yom of Chamsin, and he goes in the desert. Yes, it could be very hot there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's generally true, right? Like, I think by default, most of us break our fast by drinking something. I think you're right. So the idea is that, but in other words, if he would have to go this whole distance, not knowing, when he'll get back, knowing that he will not be able to get back until later, plus he has to be out in the sun, and maybe it's very hot, and so it can be very I don't want to say demoralizing. It's, in other words, it could provoke more hunger, but he knows that he has 10 opportunities to break his fast, and no one would blame him if he needs to break his fast. So I think this is part of the whole scene here, that the way it's done is that, first of all, he's always accompanied by other people, which also on a fast day, I think, makes it easier to keep your fast, right? If you're all alone, I don't know if this ever happened to any of you, like to be all alone in a strange place on a fast day. It's not the same as with, if you're in the company of people, like if you're going to shul or whatever, then maybe you'll be hungry, but, it's not that you can pass the time with other people. It's easier. So I think this is all part of the way this is supposed to be set up. And that there is this idea that seems to be promoted here that when he comes to the point where he needs to push the Sir Azazel off the cliff, that is something that he's supposed to really be doing alone. But pretty much everything up to that point, he's going to have people with him, and he has the opportunity to break his fast. So it's, it works out. I think it was a very well thought out plan. And they would accompany him from one sukkah to another sukkah. So now the Bartan is also explaining the nuts and bolts of this. Shem Yerushalayim v'ad sukkah rishona mil. Right, so remember there are 10 sukkot. He's going to go a total distance of 12 mil. So from Yerushalayim to the first sukkah is 1 mil. The Eser sukkot, and there are 10 sukkot. The Ilven kol sukkah v'sukkah mil. There's 1 mil distance between each of them. Hare Yerushalayim ad sukkah achrona 10 mili. So from where he steps out of the city until he gets to the last sukkah, it's 10 milim. So that's 20,000 amot. Nish'ar misukkah achrona letzuk shnei milim. So that leaves 2 more mil until he gets to the tzuk. Lavino to mil kamidat chum Shabbat. So they accompany him for 1 mil. In other words, the person who's in the last sukkah accompanies him for 1 meal. So now he gets to the 11th meal. Yomdin meirachok v'roin et masav. And then they'll stand there and watch him go the last meal by himself. So the way the sukkot are set up with this distance between each one is a meal, or presumably just short of a meal, right? Because we said it's 7.5 ris per meal, and we know that that's just short of a meal. It's 1995 amot. So each one of them can go, each person who's inhabiting those sukkot, so they've been sitting there since the beginning of Yom Kippur. That's their task. They sit there for Yom Kippur to be ready for the Ish Iti. And then all of them are allowed to walk as far as Tchum Shabbat, which is 2,000 amot. So they're all walking essentially just shy of 2,000 amot. And then they can go back to their sukkah. And the Ishiti, because it's Gzerat Katu, the Torah says that he has to take this animal out to the Midbar, he's patur. Also, the idea of Tchum Shabbat, there's machloket whether it's d'oraita or d'rabbanan. But I think the point is that even if it's d'oraita, he would still have an exemption from staying within Tchum Shabbat, because the Torah says that he has to take the seer to the midbar. So he's going to end up walking that day a total of how much? Actually, I'll come back to that question in a moment. Keep that question in mind. So far, he's walked 12 mil. So now, what does he do when he gets out there? This is Mishnah Vav. Mehayah Oseh. What what did he do? Cholek lashon shel zahorit, chetzio kashar basela, v'chetzio kashar ben shtei karnav, udchafo la'achorav. Okay, so we remember that the Kohen Gadol, when he did the lots that chose each of the Seirim for their specific tasks, one to be a Chatat and one Azazel, he took a strip, a crimson strip. And the one that was Chatat, where did he put the crimson strip for the one that was Chatat? He takes a crimson strip for each of them, right? So he put them in distinct places so that they also wouldn't get mixed up which one was which.
But was it the neck?
Yeah, so the one that was chatat, he put it al beit shchitato. He puts it around the neck because that's a reminder that that one's going to be slaughtered. And what did they do with the what did he do with the other one?
That one was the horns.
Yeah, so the one, the Sir Azazel, this whole time the Sir Azazel is walking and it has this crimson strip around its horns. So now at this point, the Ish Iti takes that strip of crimson and he divides it in two. Chatzio kashar basela, half of it, so one half he ties onto a rock. Chatzio kashar ben shtei karnav, and then he takes the other half and ties it back between his horns. Udechafo la'achorav, and he pushes it backwards. And it turns over and goes down. And it wouldn't get even halfway down before it would be made into limbs and limbs. Meaning what?
It as it's rolling down or falling down the cliff, it falls apart.
Yeah, it must have been a very rough cliff, right? A rough mountainside, right? So it's falling apparently on rocks as it's going down, probably jagged rocks, and it's actually coming apart as it's going down. Then he would go and sit himself under the last sukkah until it would get dark. So how far away was the last sukkah?
Two mil from the place where.
Right. Yes. So it's 2 meals. So now how many meal has he walked that day?
14.
14. So it was, it was not for the faint of heart, you had to be somebody who was going to be able to walk that distance without eating or drinking. So that was his route. And from what time do the clothes become tameh? So the Mishnah said, the Tanakama says, from the time that he goes out of the wall of Jerusalem. Rabbi Shimon Omer mishat techiyato latzuk. And Rabbi Shimon says from the time that he pushes him to the cliff. So just to remind us about the Tumah, so what does the Torah say? Let's read this again. You know what? Let me give you a bigger screen. Yeah. Let's read a few psukim because we're going to be talking about some of these things now. So, okay, so Pasuk Kaf, back in Parshat Achrayimot, V'chila mikaperet hakodesh v'tol moed v'et hamizbeach v'yikriv et ha'seir achai. So after the Kohen Gadol finished doing the kapara in the Kodesh, HaKodeshim, and in the Kodesh, and on the Mizbeach, then they bring forth the living seir. The seir achai is the seir la'azazel. Pasuk Kaf Aleph, he says the vidui, and the pasuk ends off by saying, "V'shilach biyad ish iti hamidbara." He sends it off with the ish iti to the wilderness. V'nasa hasir alav et kol avonotam el eretz gzeira, and the seir carries on it all of the sins, and all of their sins to eretz gzeira. We'll talk about what that means in a little bit. V'shilach et haseir b'midbar. And he sends the seer he sends the goat to the wilderness. And then in the meantime, Aaron goes into the Ohel Moed, he takes off the linen clothes, the white clothes, that he had worn when he came into the Kodesh, meaning in this context, the Kodesh HaKodeshim, he takes those off and he leaves them there in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. And you recall, we looked a little bit at the Gemara there, exactly what that means. But then what does he do? He goes to the mikvah, he washes his flesh with water in a holy place, and he puts on his clothes. So then he goes out and he does the olah of his olah, it was the olah of the Kohen and the olah of the people that were mentioned back here, right? Back in Pasuk Gimel, B'zot yavo ran el kodesh, b'far b'an b'kar l'chatat v'ayu la'olah. So the Kohen had to bring a par lechatat, which he's already brought the blood for, but we haven't quite finished with everything with the par yet, because we didn't talk about what happened to the rest of the par, what happened to the rest of the bull after he took the blood. We'll talk about that in a moment. But he also had to bring an ayu la'olah. In Pasukei, it says, so from the people at large, we had two sirim. One was chatat, and the ayil shnei sirei zim lechatat, two goats for a chatat, which we understand later on is that one is for a chatat per se, and one of them is a sir la'azazel. For certain purposes, though, the Torah calls both of them l'chatat, and they also have ayu echad la'olah. So now we're up to this. Now we're up to the part where he has to deal with the olot. So this is pasuk kaf daled. Rachatzet besora b'mayim b'makom kadosh v'avashet b'gadav yatsa v'yasa et olato v'et olat ha'am. Now he does his olah and the olat ha'am v'chiper ba'ado v'ad ha'am. This is also a kapara. Then it says v'chelev ha'chatat yakdir ha'mizbecha. The chelev, the fat of the chatat is going to be burnt on the mizbeach. So what's the chelev hachatat? So Rashi explains, emurei par v'seir. Here what it means is the parts that are going to, of the par and the seir that were already brought as a chatat, now he's going to take them and burn them on the mizbeach. The person who sent off the seir la'azazel has to wash his clothes. So whenever the Torah says Yechabeis begadav, what does that mean? wash his clothes. Why does he have to wash his clothes?
He's tameh.
So he became tameh, and he was mitameh, and it was mitameh begadim. So he was a rishon, or he was, rishon is mitameh begadim. So by the mere act of having taken the sir la'azazel makes his clothes tameh. So he has to be mechabes begadav, v'rachatzet b'saro b'mayim. So he's tameh. So both he is tameh and his clothes are tameh. V'acharechen yavo el hamachaneh. And then afterwards he can come into the camp, right? Because as long as he's tameh, he's not allowed inside the camp, which in the midbar, that meant that he had to go outside of not the entire camp, but outside of Machaneh Leviyah, I believe. And he couldn't go into the area of the around the Mishkan or the Mishkan. So that's okay. Let's just read a little bit more. Ve'et para chatat v'tzira chatat asher hu ba et damam v'chaper b'kodesh. So now, back to the par and the seir that were already brought as a chatat, that their blood had been brought to atone in the Kodesh. That was the blood that was sprinkled in various places and in various ways by the Kohen Gadol earlier. So what do you do with them? Yotzi el michutz machaneh. Those, in other words, the rest, what's left of them, you take outside of the machaneh. B'sarfu ba'esh et orotam ve'et b'saram ve'et pirsham. And they burn, and they will burn in a fire their skin and their flesh and their waste. That's the side. V'hasoref otam yichabes bigadav. The one who burns them, he also has to wash his clothes. He's tameh, just like the person who took the sir la'azazel. And then it goes into the rest of it. But that's that ends the Torah's description of the avodah that was particular to Yom Kippur. In the Beit HaMikdash, there were still other things to be done. But now, let's go back to the Mishnah. So that's just to explain this last part. We're going to go through this whole mission again, but just to explain this last part. So this fellow who pushed the Sir La'azazel off the cliff, the Torah says that he's tameh and his clothing is tameh. So at what point does his clothing become tameh? So Tanakama says from the time he leaves Jerusalem, his clothing is already tameh. Rabbi Shimon says it's from the time he pushes it off of the cliff. So we'll look a little bit at that in the Bartanura. So let's go back to the Bartanura and all of this. What was the whole point of him tying the lashon, of splitting this strip of crimson and tying part of it on a rock and part of it on the horns? Why did he do that? The Mishnah doesn't say why he did that. In other words, before we look at the Bartanura, let's just think about this for a moment. Earlier in the Mishnah, as we said, he designated each of the Seirim by where he put a strip of crimson. So he put a strip of crimson around the neck of the one that was going to be for Chatat, and a strip of crimson around the horns of the one that was Lazazel. And at that point, it serves the purpose of distinguishing the two, because in an ideal situation, they would have looked exactly alike. The two goats would have looked exactly alike. And so by tying the strips of crimson in particular places, then they won't accidentally get mixed up in the few minutes that they might possibly get mixed up. And then he goes off and he has this strip of crimson that's presumably around the horns of the animal the whole time till he gets to the tzuk. And then he takes it and he splits it. So you could ask the question, like, what does he need the strip of crimson for at all? You know, once the Seir L'Chatat was taken and slaughtered, there's no chance of them getting mixed up anymore. So he didn't presumably need the strip of crimson at all. So why does he have it? Okay, so we'll see as we go on. Let's see what the Bartanura says this about. So first of all, there's a question, why is it there at all? And then second of all, why does he now take it and split it and, you know, and leave put part of it back on the animal and part of it onto a rock? So Bartanura says, Chatzil kashar basela, b'chatzil kashar ben kanav. He would tie half of it on the rock and half of it between the horns of the animal. Bartanura says, Lo haya kosher kol halashon shel zuhurid basela. He wouldn't tie the entire strip of crimson on the rock. Shemet talbin miyad kodem d'chifat ha'seir, because maybe it's going to turn white before he pushes the goat off of the cliff. In other words, there's this idea that the strip is going to turn white as a sign that Hashem granted kapara for their sins, and that's mentioned here. It's a couple of Mishnayot away. It's the very end of this chapter. Where Rabbi Yishmael says, "Lashon shel zuhurit haya kashur al pitcho sha'echal k'shigia seir lemidbar haya lashon malbin." There was a strip of a crimson strip was tied onto the opening of the hechal, and when the seir would get to the wilderness, then the strip would turn white. And so the idea is, we'll come back to that. There was still a strip back in the Beit HaMikdash. And there was also this strip that the shaliach had. But the idea is that ben kach u'ben for each of the strips, now they're serving a different purpose. In the beginning, they served the purpose simply of distinguishing the seirim, but now they have a different purpose, which is people are going to watch to see if the strips turn white. And if they turn white, that's supposed to be a divine symbol, a divine indication that now their sins have been forgiven. If you remember, a long time ago in one of the other shiurim, I brought some sources about things started to go wrong 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. And one of them was, I see Michael shaking his head.
Yeah, I remember, I thought it was with was it with the death of Rabbi Shimon Tzadik? So it stopped turning white? I don't remember exactly the details.
So there were two things. In the time of Shimon Tzadik, it always turned white. And after he died, sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. And then there's another Braita that says 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple, it stopped altogether. It wouldn't turn white. So this idea, this symbol of the Lashon Shel Zuhurit turning white was, you can imagine, this would be a very important symbol. So in the context of, and we have two of them, right? So presumably they took the one from the Korban Chatat and they tied it to the opening of the Hechal. We'll talk about that later when we get there. But here, this is just this fellow. He's the Ish Iti. He takes it and he ties part of it on the rock and part of it between the horns of the animal. So the question that the Bartanura is addressing most immediately is why didn't he tie the whole strip onto the rock? What was the purpose of him tearing it in half and leaving some and tying half of it back onto the horns of the animal and then taking the other half and tying it onto the rock?
Shale?
Yes.
There's something I don't understand. This Lashon Shel Zuhurit, yes. There was a piece in the Bet HaMikdash, another one on the rock, and another one in the horns of the, and they all three turned white.
Well, so yeah. In other words, right, all three. So so really there were two, and then the one was split. But yes, that's the idea. The idea is that at the point when there would be kapara granted minas shamayim, that they're going to turn white.
Is it a rabbinical tradition? It doesn't. It's not in the Torah, I think. No,
no, and that's so that's what we see at the. We'll talk more about it probably next week or the next week or two. That's the drasha here that Rabbi Yishmael brings at the end of this chapter from Imi Yuchatayechem Kashanim Kasheleg Yalbinu, right? It's a pasuk in Yeshayahu. But yes, apparently there was a tradition that this would literally be true, as it were. There would be a literal whitening of that symbol of their sin. So the Lashon Shel Zuhurit was a symbol of all of the sins of Bnei Yisrael. L'minehem, right? So the different categories of sin, like I said, because the Chatat is kapara for certain types of sins, and the Tzil Azazel is a kapara for certain other types of sins, which we have not yet distinguished. The Mishnah here, like I said, the Mishnah here doesn't distinguish. There are other sources that distinguish, mainly in the Mishnah and Shavuot. And if you've learned the Rambam in the beginning, the first chapter of Hilchot Teshuvah, he also talks about, he distinguishes between the different kinds of kapara, and we will come back to that.
So it's a drasha. The pshat is that this Lashon Shel Zohar was just used to distinguish between the two goats.
Yeah, look, even that, there's no. We didn't see anywhere in the Torah that you have to put a Lashon Shel Zoharit on either animal. So that's what
the Torah doesn't mention the Lashon Shel Zoharit.
No,
I think we didn't read it now. No,
no, we don't have it. Right. In other words, when the animals are chosen, hold on a second. I always have to check to make sure I'm sharing the screen. Right, so we know that the Me'et B'nai Yisrael, right, from Me'et Adat B'nai Yisrael Yikach Shnei Sirei Yizim L'chatat V'yayel Echad Le'olah, and then Pasuk Zayin L'kachat Shnei Hasirim V'yamid Otam Lifnei Hashem Petach HaMoed, and then Natan Aaron Al Shnei Hasirim Gorolot Gorah Echad L'Hashem V'Gorah Echad L'Zazel. That's all it says. It doesn't make any mention. Why? It's from the Torah. Once the lots have been cast, and I know which one is which, then I start to do the Korban Chatat, and I take the Sir Lazazel, Ma'amidim oto chai, right? Like he has to stand alive, keneged the place where he's going to be taken out until the blood is going to be sprinkled from the par and the seir. But it doesn't mention
So it's not a drasha, it's a masoret, a tradition.
It's a tradition, and it's not a drasha. We don't learn it from the psukim, but it's as it were merumaz, right? It's like alluded to in some way by this pasuk in Yeshayahu by taking his metaphor, making it something concrete, right? It's really it's a metaphorical idea that it's also an interesting metaphor that sin is associated with red, and red would be associated presumably with why the color red? Blood. And this and then to take away the blood, then you would have white. So why would we associate blood with sin? This is a little bit off topic. I mean, not off topic, a little bit off of what we're talking about, but why is blood associated with sin? Because you might argue, you might say, look, blood is what you use to get kapara. But why do we say blood is associated with sin? There's not,
when you bring a korban, then the kohen took the blood of the korban and.
So maybe I should say blood is associated with kapara.
Oh, okay.
Yesh lomar. In other words, no, I mean, and I'm a little bit devil's advocate here, but I think the idea is, I'm sure there are many interpretations of this, but I think we mentioned this before, like in Hilchot Tumah, we see this idea that blood becomes something that's tameh or mitameh when you see it. So in other words, blood that's inside of a person or blood that's inside of an animal is not tameh, but or blood in, let's say dam machzor of an isha, dam vesed, it's not tameh until it comes out. And a person isn't, an animal doesn't is not mitameh until it's dead, right? In other words, it's when blood comes out. So blood is associated first and foremost with death. And it's associated with death when you see it. When you don't see it, it's associated with life. But when you see it, it's associated with death. And then I think it's not a big leap to go from the idea of death to the idea of sin, right? When sin is also something that's associated with death, even if it doesn't mean literal death, right? But it means that something is wrong. And of course it can lead to death, but I think the idea that sin is associated with blood is made in that's at least one way to make that connection. It's associated with death, which is associated with sin. So this whole idea that the Lashon Shel Zorit is going to turn white is quite a fascinating idea, because it gives the people a tangible sign that they have gotten kapara, right? So that would have been very reassuring. And under the circumstances, we're talking about time of the Beit HaMikdash, and the whole idea of the Beit HaMikdash is that that's where the Shekhinah dwells. So there is this sense that Hashem, as it were, the Shekhinah, is right there with them. And if they're doing what they're supposed to do, then Hashem is going to do what he's supposed to do. In this way, they have this tangible sign. So I would think it would be very, very strong and very moving. Hang on. Let's go back to the Bartanura. Yeah. Okay. So like I say, so the Bartanura here, when he's already dealing with not all of the questions that we had, he's already taken those for granted. He's dealing with the question of, at this point, when the Ish Iti is by the tzuk, and he's about to push the goat over the side of the mountain, why does he split the strip of the crimson strip? Why does he split it at all? Why doesn't he just take the whole thing and tie it on the rock? So in other words, presumably he'll want to keep it so that he can see if it turns white. So if that's the reason he's going to keep it, why not keep the whole thing? Why does he put any of it back onto the animal? So the Bartanura explains, Lo haya kosher kol halashon shel zorit basela. He didn't tie the entire strip of crimson onto the rock. Why? Shemet talbin miyad kodem d'chifat asir. Because there's a possibility that it could turn white before he had a chance to push the goat over the cliff. And because of the happiness that he would feel seeing the strip of crimson turn white, that would be showing that the sins have already been atoned for. He would forget about the mitzvah of pushing the animal over. He would already imagine that the mitzvah is done. Since the strip has turned from crimson to white. He'll think, oh, that's it. We've gotten kapara. I don't have to think about pushing this animal over the edge because we've already gotten kapara. So that's why he doesn't tie it entirely around the rock. But how does that answer the question? So, in other words, he doesn't tie it entirely around the rock because if he did and it turned white, then he'd forget about pushing the animal over. But so what? So now he has half of it around the rock. What if the half that's around the rock turns white? He might still forget about pushing the animal over. What did he accomplish by putting the other half on the animal?
Why should he turn white before the animal dies? It doesn't make sense.
No, actually, so this, by the way, that's a very important point, which I think we alluded to earlier, and it's something we should come back to. No, we did. We alluded to it in one of the earlier shiurim. There's an idea, right, that it's possible that kapara could be granted prior to the death of the Sir Lazazel. Because what did the Torah say? The Torah doesn't say that the animal has to die. What does it say about the Sir Lazazel? Let's go back for a second and look. Just a second. See, so it says, Pasuk Chavbet, V'nasah ha'sa'ir alav v'kol avonotam al eretz gzeira. So the goat is going to carry on it all of their sins to Eretz Gzeira. We haven't defined exactly what that means yet. V'shilach et ha'seir bamidbar. And he sends the seir to the wilderness.
So in the Torah, it doesn't kill the seir, or not
It's not
necessarily.
not necessarily.
Yes.
Not necessarily. In other words, the mitzvah of the seir la'azazel might be enough just to take it to the midbar.
Mhm.
That could be enough. And in fact, we had an idea about that earlier. You know what? It's getting late, so maybe I'll come back to it. But let's just say, for the purposes of understanding this right now, that's enough for us to say. So that's one thing. But let's just go back and see again what the Bartanura said. So he didn't. Excuse me. Just need to get a little water. 1 second. Okay, so he didn't tie. He took the strip. He takes it and he splits it in two. He ties half of it around the rock, half of it around the horns of the seir. And the reason the Bartanura says that he doesn't tie the whole strip around the rock is because maybe it's going to turn white before he had a chance to push the animal off the cliff. And then and when he sees it turns white, he'll forget about pushing the animal off the cliff. So it's not 100% clear from what the Bartanura just said how that answers the question of why he split it. He's saying, because that could happen, but that could also happen. In other words, so now he has half of it. So what if the half that's on the rock turns white? Shouldn't he also, maybe he would also forget about pushing the animal off the cliff? So we'll come back to that in a second. The other half of what he says, though, he also wouldn't tie it entirely around the horns of the animal. Why? Shema b'shat chifa yachof haseir rosho tachat gufo k'shipol la'achorav v'lo yuchal lirot halashon k'shitalbin. Because if he put the entire thing, in other words, if he left the entire strip around the horns of the animal, when he pushed it off, maybe when he pushes it off, the animal's going to fall in such a way that he's going to tuck his head under his body when he's falling back. And then the Ish Iti who's watching him won't be able to see what happens to the strip, if it turns white or not. V'hiyu kol Yisrael atzevin, and all of Israel will be sad. V'fichach kashar chetzi basela, v'hilo talbin lechatzain ad shetigmor melechet kula. And it's not going to turn white by half. In other words, the half of it can't turn white until he finishes all of the work. Then when he, at the end, when he split the strip and he tied half of it on the rock, and then at the end he ties half of it between the horns of the seir. Af al pi shetalbin miyad. This is where the Bartanura answers the question we asked a moment ago. Even if right now the strip turns white, lo yaniach mildachvo, he won't leave it from being pushed over, ho'il v'hu asukba, because he's going to be busy with it. In other words, there's a specific order that he's supposed to do this. He takes the crimson strip, he tears it in half, and first he ties half of it around the rock. That's dafka, because then the second thing he's supposed to do is to tie the second half around the horns of the seir, so that even if it turns white, he won't forget that he still has to push the seir over the side, because he'll be busy right with the seir. So if you've taken the whole thing and tied it around the rock and it turned white, so the seir would be over here, he'd be next to the rock, he'd say, oh joy, we're all atoned for, and he'd start walking back to the sukkah. But this way, he had to tie the other one around the horns at the end, and so even if right now it turns white, and he'll see it turns white, he would still push it over. And if it doesn't turn white, he'll push it over, but he can still find out if it does turn white by looking at the strip that's still on the rock. So after he does all that, so then he goes and he sits himself down. He goes back to the last sukkah. Ve'af al pi shehayotzei chutz latchum afilu birshut. Even though it's true that a person who goes past the tchum Shabbat, even with permission, like the Ishiti, he has permission to go past the tchum Shabbat because he has this task to do. Afil birshut chachamim, even if the chachamim gave him permission, ein lo ela alpaim ama mimakom shiatza lasham birshut. The din is that he's only allowed now to walk 2,000 amot altogether from wherever he got up to with permission. And how far away is he now from the sukkah? When he's at the tzuk, how far away is he from the sukkah?
Well, we said it before, 2 mil.
2 mil, which is how many amot? Okay, it's 4,000 amot. In other words, he's 2 tchumim away from the sukkah.
So he already did his work.
Exactly. In other words, yes. So right. So now he's finished his work, and
nevertheless, he goes beyond the Tchum Shabbat. He steps.
Right.
He walks.
Right. Exactly. No, right. In other words, so this fellow at the midst of this is a chidush that he goes back and sits at the last sukkah. The last sukkah is more than 2,000 amot away, and under other circumstances, a person who went out beyond the Tchum Shabbat with permission, wherever he gets to and finishes doing what he needed to do with that permission, he should only now be able to walk 2,000 amot. But here the Chachamim let him walk 4,000 amot. Because he'll be afraid to stand in the midbar until it gets dark. In other words, there's a heter for him under the circumstances for his own safety and his own sense of security. By the way, where did we learn that a person who goes beyond Tchum Shabbat, once they finish their task, their mitzvah, that they have 2,000 amot to walk? Where did we learn that? Not in this Masechet, in a previous Masechet. Can you remember another time when Chachamim were matir somebody to go past Tchum Shabbat for a mitzvah? Think about Rosh Hashanah, Masechet Rosh Hashanah. Okay, not for Rosh Hashanah per se, but for
Well, it wasn't for to get the lulav and etrog, was it?
no, not for that.
For the
No.
shofar? I don't know.
No, the hefech. But no, where do we have? We had Eduta Chodesh. If you
Okay.
give Eduta Chodesh and you had to get to Yerushalayim, you were allowed to go even past Chum Shabbat.
Mhm.
Remember, the Mishnah says that it used to be that once they would get there, the original din was that once they would get there, they only had Arba Amot. They only allowed to go Arba Amot. And Rabbat Gamliel made a takana that he gave them 2,000 Amot, right? So that they could go, like they could walk around the city. They wouldn't have to be stuck in one place because otherwise they were afraid that people wouldn't come. Right, and also it fits into this idea that Tchum Shabbat is bichlal an isur d'Rabbanan, it's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. And so the Rabbanan had some leeway about when they would be makil. So here also the Ish Iti, they're makil with him to go that even though he finished his task, not only did they give him 2,000 amot, but they give him 4,000 amot because otherwise he's going to end up alone in the midbar at night. And that's not a happy place to be. So let's finish off this Mishnah. Right? Mitamei begadim. Tichtiv v'mashalech tasir lazazel yechabes begadav. Mishi yetzei chutz lechomat Yerushalayim. So here, from what point is the Ishiti, at what point does he become Tameh to be Mitameh Begadim? So according to the Tanakama, it's from the time he leaves Yerushalayim. So what does that tell you about his mitzvah? His mitzvah is to take the Seira Mishtaleach. And so what does it tell you about his mitzvah? When does he accomplish the mitzvah per se?
When he leaves the city.
You could argue that according to the Tanakama, that why does the Tanakama hold that he's mitamei begadim as soon as he leaves the city? Because that fulfills the description in the Torah that he has to take him to Hamidbara. He has to take him toward or to the Midbar, and that's enough. That's enough. So he's tamei already to be mitamei begadim. And Rabbi Shimon says, Mishat Techiyato Latzuk. So we can understand Rabbi Shimon holds no, that the real completion of the mitzvah here is to push the animal off of the cliff. And only then does he become tamei. Only then are his begadim tamei. And so we see here also there are different opinions about what happens to how much has to happen to the Seir HaMishtaleach. But we saw also, right, remember earlier, I will now just to finish off, we talked about, 1 second. We talked about, according to Rabbi Yehuda, no, that's not the right one.
Shel?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. According to the Tanakama, it looks that the fact that he brings the goat to the cliff is a kind of hidur, because he doesn't have to do it. According to the Torah, it's just that's the way you explain it.
No. So
it's a curious hidur.
So no. So I wouldn't use the term hidur. There's a notion. In terms of in terms of nomenclature, you'd say la mitzvah. There's this idea of doing things la mitzvah and below the ikuva, right? So the mitzvah is to take it maybe to the tzuk, but it's not ma'akev. It doesn't hold back the mitzvah, even if it didn't go. Because we do have this idea that, and I think now it may not be from the Mishnah, it's from something here, maybe from the Gemara, I have to think about it, that once the blood has been sprinkled from the seer and the par, then if the seer Azazel dies, let's say it had a heart attack, it died, you don't have to do another hagralah. So we know that it's not ma'akev in all instances. And I don't know, since the last couple of weeks that I've been preparing for these shiurim, I've been thinking about this whole idea, because yes, it would seem like the whole idea of pushing the animal off the cliff is also something that would seem to be very cruel, and maybe it seems almost needlessly cruel. So why is it that seems to be that the mitzvah does seem to be that? What is that about? And especially given the fact that at least b'diavad, right, it's not ma'akev. If for some reason, let's say he got all the way up to the tzuk and the animal ran off, he wouldn't, we'd still, he wouldn't go back and get another one to do it again. It is what it is, and it's not ma'akev the whole process. It's not ma'akev the kapara. So it's really a lot of food for thought, I think, why it gets done that way.
I ask myself something else. Why wouldn't the Kadosh Baruch Hu call the kapara before he pushes the goat over the cliff, and he would at least save this poor animal?
No, yesh lomar. In other words, right. So the chashash that the Bartanura talks about, the Gemara here talks about this. The chashash that he'll see that it turns white, which does indicate there is kapara. So maybe it also indicates it doesn't have to
be something nice.
I don't know. We have, we spent some time about this on the Siyum Mishalech way back at the beginning of the series of the Shiurim, and now also we come back to it. I don't know. It's still a very puzzling. It's still a very puzzling mitzvah. Very, very puzzling. Exactly what's going on with that. It's also called a chatat and so forth. Anyway, I think we'll stop here. Wait a second. Okay, so next time, I think what we'll do is we'll try to finish these Mishnayot, and I keep piling up extra things that we should do, but one of the things I think we'll do before we go on to the next chapter is I do want to talk about the distinct kaparot that are accomplished with the different acts. So maybe not next week, but the week after. We'll try to do that. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you, everybody, and hopefully see you next week.
Thank you. Good night.
Good evening. Bye-bye.